Latest happening in Congo. We'll definitely keep you informed about the regional matters. But something else is happening just this month in Africa, and it has been dubbed the Africa COP. I'm talking about the COP27 summit that will be happening in Egypt. And I'm just taking a look at the theme for this year, Together in Implementation, even as African countries are sort of bearing the brunt of climate change. As you can see in Nigeria recently, some parts of the country are facing immense flooding. Right here in East Africa region, including Kenya, the drought is definitely ravaging parts of the country. So we are feeling the effects of climate change, and this makes it an important discussion to have. Now, right now, ahead of the COP27 summit that will be happening in Egypt, we want to unpack carbon credit and the benefits that are in store for Kenya as a country. Remember, we're dealing with the adverse effects. What can we do to perhaps make it better in order to alleviate the suffering amongst the population? So I'm joined by Stella Ojango, who is a partner at Gikera and Vadgama Advocates. She's equally an environmental expert. And perhaps you can break ice by finding out, are you making your way to Egypt later on? Because it's the Africa COP. Yeah.
Thank you. Glad to be here this evening. I will not be making it to Egypt for COP27,
okay,
but I'm very glad that COP has come to Africa, nearly
True.
10 years since we last had COP in Africa.
Okay. And that's really proper. So we're talking about Africa hosting the COP27 summit. And from your point of view, perhaps before we get into the nitty-gritty details to do with carbon trading, what do you think needs to be done in order to make sure that it's not all talk this time round? Because there have been promises that have been handed on that particular platform, looking at COP26 and the previous meetings, where the high emitters sort of promised to, we'll cushion you through perhaps funds, through changing or reducing the carbon emission. But a few years later, we're still facing the adverse effects of climate change. From you, what should be the major taking home point from the COP27 summit?
I would like to see the developed countries meet their commitment of financing their $100 billion USD fund that is yet to be met, which is actually the floor, not the ceiling. So we need to achieve that. That will be a great take home for me. Okay,
that's really proper. So let's talk about carbon trading. What exactly should we understand from this particular point? Carbon trading.
Carbon trading. Very simply put, carbon trading is a marketplace for buying and selling carbon permits to enable the emitter be able to meet their target of emission when one is set in their mother country.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's as simple as that. And as Kenya, how exactly can we benefit, and how much carbon has been traded so far, perhaps? Yeah.
So for Kenya, we need one thing. We need regulations to cover carbon trading. What we have in Kenya is a Constitution of Kenya 2010, which provides for sustainable development, Article 10 thereof. Article 42 provides for the right to a clean and safe environment, and further provides for the use of the environment in a sustainable manner. Article 69 provides that we should have at least 10% of our country with tree cover. But when it comes to carbon trading, closer home we have the Climate Change Act of 2016. It urges that we come up with ways to reduce our emission, but we do not have a platform by way of regulation for carbon trading. So that is a starting point. That is where we need to start to benefit from this.
So regulations on carbon trading, that will definitely go a long way. But equally, we've had the president speak about planting more trees, and he's really taken this with so much enthusiasm. Perhaps if we talk about how Kenya can ramp up its efforts to mitigate climate change, and perhaps double it up with ramping up carbon trade as well. What can we do to ensure that as much as we're waiting for these advanced countries to honor their agreement at COP27, we're not sitting down waiting, we're equally perhaps implementing, as you've mentioned right there. What can we do to ramp up the carbon trading in Kenya, even as we move in earnest to plant more trees?
So it is commendable, the suggestion and commitment of the president in terms of Kenya having or meeting that 10% tree cover, which I must say should still be the floor, not the ceiling. But how do we go about that? We've got to be very practical. From my 2 cents is that we need to do that using the public land that we already have that is being held by our schools, that is both primary schools and secondary schools, that have a lot of land that is laid bare because the schools have the school infrastructure, then a big playground. If you can only take a quarter of that and put that under tree cover, we will be way ahead in achieving that 10% tree cover. We have the standard gauge railway line that was recently commissioned here in Kenya. That railway line runs for 485 kilometers, roughly call it 500 kilometers, right from Nairobi to Miritini, Mombasa. That railway line can be a parcel of land on both sides of that railway line. If we can put tree cover on that land, we will be doing so much that by the time we have the regulations for carbon trading, we are already showing means and ways of how we have curbed greenhouse gas emission and now can recover and recoup because of the tree cover that we've already put. Not just tree planting, we also need to change the sources of energy that we need to go to energies that do not emit greenhouse gases. We need to do geothermal, we need to do hydro, and for hydro it means we need to replenish our dams. There is so much that we can definitely do as a nation, but definitely the starting point, our tree covers, our public schools, our railway line. Yes.
Well, the potential is there, so we definitely have to embark on this mission in earnest. And a little bit earlier on, I brought up the fact that Africa is hosting this year's edition of the COP Summit. And since it's Africa's COP, how exactly can Africa benefit from this? I know you mentioned a little bit earlier on some of these countries honoring their commitments, but how else can Africa not only play a part, but also play a leading role in terms of reducing the effects of climate change? Yeah.
Africa needs to be very, very deliberate, even in this COP27. Just giving you a bit of statistics.
Okay.
In East Africa, we had 3 floods in the 1980s. By the 1990s, we had 7 floods in a year. Now, by 2016, we have 10 floods, 2 or 6, 10 floods in a year. Okay. So, if Africa is deliberate, even in attending this COP and in pushing and agitating for our benefit, because number one, we are the most hardly hit by greenhouse gas emissions. We are the hardly hit by climate change. So, if we are deliberate and we push for number one, accessing those funds. You see, the funds may even be achieved. The 100 million USD may even be achieved, but how much is trickling down to Africa? So that's what we should be agitating for. Of that 100 billion, or even the 80 billion that may have been achieved, how much of that is trickling down to Africa? And as it's trickling down to Africa, in what form? Is it grants? Is it loans? And if it's loans, what are the interest rates for these loans? So that then they're not punitive. We are not accessing it, but then paying through our noses.
True. Okay, that's really proper. So Africa definitely needs to agitate more. But I have to ask the question, why have these funds been delayed? Because it's been a sing-song time and time again. We've seen governments change. Example, in the United States, in the UK as well, who have had over 4 prime ministers in a short span. So how can Africa, irrespective of which leader is there, actually agitate for these funds? And what's the reason for these funds delaying in the first place?
Thank you. That's a very, very good question. And my simple answer is goodwill. We need goodwill from the developing countries, from the developed countries.
Okay.
And commitment from the developing countries to be accountable for those resources when they're sent our way. And a good example is COVID-19. When COVID-19 kicked in 2 years back, we saw the goodwill of the global world, the village and the developed countries to put money into COVID-19 and to send out vaccines, not only to their countries, but to the developing countries. If we can have just half of that committed to climate change, we will definitely achieve this issue of that 100 million and much more to curb climate change, which is not only affecting the developing countries, but also the developed countries.
So as much as in Kenya, you need goodwill to implement some things that are on paper, equally, in the international scale, we definitely need goodwill for them to hold their end of the bargain so we can definitely benefit. That's really proper. As I was looking at the theme a little bit earlier on, it's all to do with together for implementation. So what's the way forward in terms of climate mitigation from where you sit? What Kenya needs to do, what Africa generally needs to do in order not just to make it a talking point, but actualize it. We don't want the same issues in terms of perhaps on paper, we are getting everything right. But when it comes to implementation, that's where the crack of the matter is, as they say. Yeah.
If I may take you back a little bit, we have the United Nations Framework Climate Convention of 1994. That is a mother convention of where matters climate change were discussed. That convention was amended by the Kyoto Protocol in 2005. In 2015, the member countries came together and passed the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is the main document that came up with milestones in terms of implementation. So with this COP27 happening in Egypt, we need to check these milestones. One of the milestones that was that each member country has got to submit its national determined contribution in terms of emissions. What is your national determined contribution for each country? And it's that the national determined contribution is reviewed every 5 years. So for Kenya, our target was 30%. Now we've gone up to 32%. Previously, and the target is to reach 100% no emission. So we have grown. We have grown. Our target is to get to 100%. So we have grown. And with that growth, with the 32%, as Kenya, our commitment was 21% of that will be self-funded by the country, while 79% will be funded through probably the global finance when that is achieved. So what we should do in terms of implementation is check ourselves and the member states against the Paris Agreement. Have we achieved our national determined contribution? And what are we doing over and above that? Remember, the target under the Paris Agreement is to achieve 2% centigrades below pre-industrial period in terms of emissions, with a long-haul target of 1.5% degree centigrade pre-industrial time to reduce our emission to that level. So that is a target for the global countries under the Paris Agreement. How far are we in achieving that? And what are we doing to achieve that, even at our national level, as member countries, especially developed countries? And what are we doing to developing countries for them to also achieve? Because it is across board. Every country is to reduce their emission. But what are we doing? Check against those requirements under the Paris Agreement. Ensure we have met them.
Well, every country definitely needs to pull its weight in one or the other, either being a developed country or a developing country as well. We'll definitely be following up on the developments happening in Egypt during the COP27 summit. But that's just a breakdown in terms of carbon trading, how and why it's important, in terms of the implementation, the steps we need to take. And that's why Stella has just broken down some of those nitty-gritty details when it comes to matters to do with climate change and carbon trading. Asante sana, Stella Ojango joining us. She's a partner at Gikera and Vadgama Advocates, equally an environmental expert. It's a pleasure.